Because YouTube is more broken than ever, if you want to see more Final Fantasy VII Remake, Kingdom Hearts, and The Legend of Zelda content, I'd really appreciate it if you can hit the bell after subscribing, that way you'll never miss another video again. I don't think it'll come off as strange to anyone when they hear me say that the ending of Final Fantasy VII Remake was very confusing, yet very revealing when you take a moment to really look at what we're seeing here. I honestly feel it's close to impossible to catch a majority of these details your first time watching this, primarily because we weren't given a full grasp of what's actually happening because the characters in game don't have that clear understanding either. But for those who may not know and others who just want confirmation, let's go over what we really believe was happening in the endgame, right after the motorcycle segment of leaving Shinra HQ. And as I'm sure you can guess by now, this video is filled to the brim with spoilers for the ending of Final Fantasy VII Remake, and even more so that because I believe I'm on the right track with this theory slash thought dump, it could potentially spoil future parts of Final Fantasy VII Remake. So if you don't want to take that chance, I won't blame you. But if you want to make some kind of sense of the ending of the game you spent $60 on, well, then let's mosey. Okay, so there's no easier way to dance around this, so let's dive headfirst in unbelievable territory. This game isn't really a remake of Final Fantasy VII. Well, not entirely at least. This is Final Fantasy VII remade, but in terms of story, it's more of a reimagining of the original story in most ways, primarily because of a lot of similar things happen in this game, just in a different and more quote-unquote modern way, if that's the best way to describe it. But that's not just me referring to the added events and interactions between characters, it goes for the whole game. Well, except the ending. This is where Final Fantasy VII Remake kind of kicks the original aside in order to show players that it's standing aside the original on its own 2 feet. As I'm sure everyone who's watching this realizes if they've played the original, it is very, very different than the original End of Midgar. The game is kind of self-aware at this part. The characters are confronted with what they want to do, but struggles to decide at first if they should go against fate, which is in this situation referring to the original game. The game acknowledges that the original timeline exists and is how the timeline is supposed to unfold. And because the original timeline has already happened and already exists, we know this because we know fate is supposed to go a certain way, as the game makes this vividly clear here. The Whispers, the ghost-like entities of Final Fantasy VII Remake, their appearance only occurs in this timeline because elements of differentiations have begun to appear in the world. So now they're needed to guide humans on the correct paths, which again, they only know to do because there is already an established timeline. But different from the original, these characters, because of the differentiations appearing in their adventure at the end, they're presented the opportunity to change fate, with great risk of course, but if you want to beat the game, you gotta go along with what the homies want. You head through the portals and you'll soon be fighting a number of bosses. They're each a different kind of elite wisp, primarily because they all have names. Let's look a bit closer at these guys. Whisper Rubrum here. If you use your assess ability or simply look at their data, you can read their brief description. Rubrum's reads as follows: an entity from a future timeline that has manifested in the present day. It fights with a sword to protect the future that gave shape to it. Of course, I'm sure this is already weird when you read it briefly, but let's deconstruct a bit of this sentence. An entity from a future timeline. This line is quite interesting for a couple of reasons. Well, first things first, normally this phrase should be an entity from the future or an enemy from a future timeline. If anything, these would make more sense. But saying an entity from a future timeline implies this entity is from a different future than what lies ahead for our main cast currently. Now let's keep going. That is manifested in the present day. It fights with a sword to protect the future that gave shape to it. Okay, so this pretty much just confirms a majority of what I'm saying here. Let's look closer. Again, we know the Whispers have manifested here in Final Fantasy VII Remake because of differentiations from the original Final Fantasy VII timeline. The Whispers are just trying to stop our heroes because they're trying to change the time from being the original timeline they come from, as both stories originate from the same point. Differences make time branch off into its own timeline separate from the original. Not only are they simply protectors of time and fate itself, but changing history may disrupt them from even being able to come into existence in the first place. But let's move forward now. We saw later on, Zack is alive now. Zack being the protagonist of Final Fantasy VII Crisis Core, the prequel to the original Final Fantasy VII game, who died at the end of Crisis Core. So using context clues from what we saw, we can see that due to our actions of essentially killing fate itself, created another alternate world. This being the world our heroes now live on, where it seems Zack lives and makes it out relatively okay. While at the same time, we can see in the following scene claim that Biggs has survived now, when before he was clearly dead as he died while with Cloud. But if you look a bit closer in this scene, there's also implications of Jessie's survival, because next to Biggs's bed, you can actually see Jessie's bandana and her gloves, both of which she was actually physically wearing when she died while with Cloud and Tifa. I know others may try to say that it's possible that it was just taken from Jessie's corpse and kept as a memento, a memory of her. While I understand something similar was done in Advent Children for another character, it's much less likely to have happened here, as no time has really passed since then, and I doubt in her situation they just ripped those items off her corpse. This image would make a lot more sense as an indicator that all three of them, Biggs, Wedge, and Jessie, are now alive in this alternative timeline. But that's not the only difference in this timeline. After you beat the final boss, you'll eventually see that other cutscene with Zack surviving the fight like I mentioned before. However, before it shows his face and the camera is panning, we know this has gotta be an alternate world than what we were a part of before, because a potato chip bag flies in the shot briefly. It's easy to not realize because of what was going on in the moment, but it's a photo of Stamp the dog, who we've seen a ton of times in the game. But what's different here is Stamp is now a completely different dog than what he was before. And for a mascot, that's something that would never just randomly happen, kind of like how Disney wouldn't just up and change Mickey from a mouse to a rat. This undoubtedly proves another timeline has been made. I know some may say this timeline that Zack is alive in is different than the one Cloud and the others are on after the final boss, but there is a detail that renders that null and void. The timeline they were on was slightly shifted from the original Final Fantasy timeline, which is why the Whispers tried to go and correct things and stop them from changing fate. Just like when Barrett died but was brought back to life, because that didn't happen in the original timeline. Now think again of how we saw Biggs wake up in bed alive at the end, when in the original timeline he died. If they were in this new timeline here and now, where fate has essentially been killed, then the Whispers would have made sure Biggs died again if he somehow survived, or honestly made sure he couldn't have come back in the first place. Going forward a bit here onto another important scene, I'm actually not going to talk about this one as the central topic of the next Final Fantasy VII Remake video I want to make, but I'll just say this so you guys have an idea and that there's a record of me thinking this before the video is actually up. I think Marlene is an ancient, just like Aerith, or well, Cetra in this case. But for now, let that sit with you. Have that bell hit for when that's up. But after this, things we basically either have no need to cover as in-depthly. The gang plan to go after Sephiroth and finish him once and for all, and then we see once again Zack, but this time he's lugging an unconscious Cloud back to Midgar after surviving the previous assault, which again shows that Zack is indeed alive now. But with that, we've basically discussed all there is to talk about the ending. There are a few more topics I want to talk about still left though, like when Cloud and Sephiroth were in space and everything looked crazy, and the topic I just mentioned about Marlene, but I think everything here will suffice for this video, as the meat of the ending and its confusion, I believe, was covered here in its entirety. But now that this is over, what do you guys think? Did the things I say sound about right, or did you have other ideas? Was there something I missed that you may have caught? Let me know down below. Oh, and if you know anyone else who's beaten the game and may be confused or honestly just want to share what I said with a homie, I'd really appreciate it. I'd love to have as many people see this as possible. If I missed anything, I need everyone in the comments to go and let me know. Even if you feel it's something someone has already said, go ahead and let me know anyway, because maybe I missed that other person's comment. That shouldn't stop you from saying what you feel I may have missed or something you may have noticed and I didn't. If you enjoyed the video and haven't already, leave me a like to show me you want to see more of this kind of content, and hit the bell after subscribing to make sure you never miss another Kingdom Hearts, Zelda, or Final Fantasy video. Thank you all so much for watching. My name is KingdomAce, and remember, my loyal knights, to always fly skyward.